Welcome to Birsay on the west mainland of Orkney. Here we are, early September in Birsay, and the Old Manse garden is showing its autumn colours. No trees in fall, but plenty of animals, plenty of annuals, still facing up to the Atlantic Ocean, just over the wall in Birsay Bay. We are at the northwest tip of Orkney mainland in the village of Palace, once the capital of Orkney and site of the medieval bishop's palace. This is also the place where St Magnus was brought after his murder in Ecclesay. The church here was founded back in 1064, and the existing manse just behind me dates from 1761. I'm Robin Barr, and with my wife Anne, we have lived in this manse since 2009. But today we are remembering the first resident in our home, the Reverend George Lowe, parish minister of Birsay and Harvey towards the end of the 18th century. Like many clerics of his time, he had many interests beyond his profession. Lowe, who had studied philosophy at St Andrews University, was a scientist first and foremost, a lover of nature, plants and animals, fossils and birds, and his observations in environmental and social science makes him one of the pioneers of the Scottish Enlightenment 250 years ago.
George Lowe came to Orkney as a young man. He remained in Orkney throughout his ministry, but he was very involved in the wider world. He corresponded with men of letters well beyond Orkney, George Peyton in Edinburgh, Thomas Pennant in Wales, and Sir John Banks, President of the Royal Society in London. John Banks was also Captain Cook's botanist on the famous circumnavigation of the world. Banks visited Stromness in 1772 and he met Lowe, and together they investigated the dunes around Scale Bay, a century before the discovery of Skara itself. Lowe excelled in his details of all that he recorded. His notebooks are full of sketches of plants, insects and listings which are recorded in his Flora Orcadensis and his Fauna Orcadensis. They provide insight into the plants and wildlife of northern regions of Scotland in the 18th century, of great value now for historians to look back on and compare to modern Orkney. His contemporary drawings of Orkney landscapes are also of note, of Kirkwall and the village of Palace here. The Earl's Palace itself and even our own manse are included in his drawings and give valuable clues to Orkney's past. So now I'm going to welcome Spencer Rosie of Orkney Heritage Society to outline more of the historical significance for Orkney of George Lowe's investigations and recordings. Thank you, Spencer.
Okay, thank you, Anne, for that. Lowe achieved so much in his lifetime, made more remarkable by the fact that he was working in isolation. Now, his tour of both Orkney and Shetland provides us with a snapshot of life in both island groups 2.5 centuries ago. He records their history, archaeology, geography, geology, agriculture, wildlife, superstitions, beliefs, customs, diseases, language, so many things. After a visit my wife and I had to Yale earlier this summer, I reread his description of that island and I found it absolutely so recognisable. It was unfortunate and a frustration to him that much of his work was used by other people, sometimes without proper acknowledgement. Possibly the worst case was the plagiarism of Lowe's History of Orkney by George Barry. Barry acquired the manuscript but then used it for his own history of Orkney published in 1805, only making a mention of Lowe's manuscript in Appendix 10 in relation to the Norn version of the Lord's Prayer. Now, Lowe often recorded what he saw in drawings. My two particular favourites are, of course, the one at Kirkwall. Not particularly brilliant piece of art, but what it does show is the large square tower next to the Bishop's Palace, which was sadly demolished in the early part of the 19th century. So here we have probably the only depiction of that structure, which would have been the original Bishop's Tower. But my particular favourite is this. He made two drawings of coats of arms from the churchyard and nesting in Shetland, and records it as the Barons of Broch, which the Sinklers of Broch were quite famous. But what we didn't know was that this belongs to Henry Sinclair, the first recorded provost of Kirkwall. His father was Edward Sinclair, the victor of Somerdale and Babdale. And what the coat of arms shows is the strong connection between the Sinclairs, Edward and Henry, to some senior members of the cathedral chapter. The first and third quarters show the engrailed cross of the Sinclairs, but the second and fourth quarters shows the three escutcheons, shields. If you take away the star, the mullet, what's called in heraldic terms, you get the same coat of arms as found above the west door of St Magnus Cathedral, which belongs to Bishop Andrew Picterus, who came across to Scotland with Princess Margaret in 1469 when she married King James III, and thus the pawning of the islands to Orkney, to Scotland. Andrew had a son, Henry Fancouff, who became Archdeacon of Shetland, and his coat of arms were found up in Shetland. Very elaborate stone, which includes the two shields and the mullets and much other things. So there's a strong suggestion here that there's a very close family connection between Edward and Henry to Henry Fancouff. And it turns out that Henry Fancouff left in his will, Edward Sinclair was his main beneficiary, which suggests that we know who Edward's second wife was, but we don't know who the first wife was. And it's a strong suggestion here that Edward's first wife was a daughter of Henry Fancouff, and thus shown in Edward's son's coat of arms. So lots of things that we can learn from Lowe's writings and drawings. But before I finish, I would just like to thank Robin and Anne for their superb hospitality, and of course for coming up with the idea of doing a plaque for George Lowe, and of course bringing it to fruition. So many thanks.
Thank you, Spencer, for such an interesting and reflections on Lowe in the terms of the breadth of interests that he had in architecture and others. We'll be hearing more about Shetland and the connection with Shetland later on. But now for some music. Birsay Beach by Orcadian fiddler John Fraser, better known as Jock in this area, who was for many years session clerk of St Magnus Church, right next door to the manse here. The Kirk minister, the Reverend George Lowe, at that time played the flute. In his spare moments, he was going round probably in his own garden here, and perhaps as he went round his parish. And here we're going to hear then the piece Birsay Beach, played this lunchtime by Orkney flautist Gemma McGregor. And thank you for Gemma for that. Really interesting. We were slightly worried it might be raining today, but Orkney has produced rather better weather. So the wooden flute, it was a Baroque wooden flute she was playing on, was able to be used in this situation. The piece, of course, Birsay Beach. Birsay Beach is just down behind us here on the, only about 20, 30 yards away. And I can think it as George Lowe was moving around his garden, he'd be thinking about going down to that beach almost on a daily basis, back and forward from here. Now, on with Anne has got a little more now to say about George Lowe.
Okay, it's been lovely listening to all the variety of information and even the music. It's really been so pleasurable. But now we're back to listening to more of the facts about George. As well as history and natural science, George Lowe was in tune with the modern environment, with modern environmental and social scientific investigation. His Welsh correspondent that I mentioned before, Thomas Pennant, had published a tour of Scotland, which was a valuable resource for future Scottish social historical information, until the first statistical account of 1791 then gave a wealth of information about the whole area, and George Lowe himself, as the parish minister for Orkney, contributed to that statistical account, and we have the information there to refer to nowadays. Pennant actually offered to fund George Lowe as a travel journalist on a fact-finding tour of Orkney and Shetland as a sequel to Pennant's own tour of Scotland. And in 1773, George Lowe started planning for his Shetland jaunt the next year to take in Fowler and the Fair Isles. This was no mean holiday trip for a cleric in potential threatening seas and storms. Environmental research was in his mind. And because of that, we are now going to, oh no, I made a mistake. Environmental research was in his mind. Writing to his Edinburgh friend, George Peyton, Lowe's aims and purpose are clear.
I must see all ranks to view the economy of the country where I'm going. To lay open, after description, the defects in agricultural, arts and manufacturers with a view to point out a method of cure. This was very much in tune with the politics of his day, a time when George Dempster, the MP for Forfarshire, was campaigning for new methods of land management and agriculture, planning the new fishing boats, all fishing stations all round the Western Isles and the north of Scotland. You can see the link with George Lowe then. George himself grew up in Edzell, in Dempster's own parliamentary constituency, and would certainly have known of his MP, no doubt inspired by him. Another notable figure of the time was the Fifeshire musician James Oswald. As Lowe is thought to have played the flute on his journeys around the parish, he would certainly have found this composition by Oswald an attractive piece of music. But let Dr. Gemma McGregor explain.
Yes, several gentlemen in the 18th century liked to play one of these for fun, and had a nice breast pocket that they carried them in. The flute, German flute, which means a wooden transverse flute, not a recorder, is referred to as the German flute usually in the 18th century, just because it came from Germany. That's where it first became popular. And this composer, James Oswald, was from Edinburgh, from Fife originally and then Edinburgh, and he wrote a lot of music and he published a lot of music. And one of the fascinating things about him was he published the Caledonia Pocket Companion, which is a tiny little book that traditional fiddlers still use, and they forget that it was actually written for the flute. And a lot of the tunes in there are used for Robbie Burns tunes, and that's how we know them, but poor old Oswald is never credited. But he wrote 96 pieces, all with the name of a flower or a shrub from Scotland, and they're called Airs for the Seasons, and I'm going to play just one of them, which is from Airs for Autumn, And that facsimile, well, it's not a facsimile, it is the original manuscript, is still in a library in Dundee. So this one is the Nightshade. And I shall try very hard not to get hair in my mouth or the wind to blow my sound away.
That tune was really most attractive, and we were all kind of keeping beat and keeping time with it, which was lovely. Thank you. And of course the title, the Nightshade, makes us think of a flower of passion and murderous intent, although in actual fact that was a very gentle, calming tune, which reflects very much the atmosphere that we hope to create in this garden. We don't, fortunately, have deadly nightshades in the garden. That wouldn't quite be in keeping with the peace and calm that we want in this lovely Manse Birsay garden. Around us at the Old Manse, as you can see, our garden is blooming. The summer flowers have still lasted, which is absolutely wonderful. It's autumn time coming in, but our flowers are still blooming for all to see. And we like to think that we pay tribute to George Lowe by tending what would have been his Old Manse garden. Although he wouldn't have called it the Old Manse at that time, it would just have been the Manse garden. We now call it the Old Manse. His dedication to the science of botany is illustrated by his detailed listings in the Flora Orchidensis, which is now in the Orkney Country Archive. And in relation to that now, can we now call on John Crossley?
Well, thank you very much for giving me the chance to pay tribute to George Lowe, the botanist. By this I mean his study of wild plants, although he was a keen gardener too. He was the first in a line of great Orkney botanists, stretching down almost to the present day. I would love to have had a good long talk with him about what he had seen in the hills of Hoy, Sandy Links and Westry, the Broch of Birsay, and so many other places he describes. But I don't think I would have been able to keep up with him because of the huge breadth of his knowledge, which covered not just flowering plants, but seaweeds, lichens, fungi, mosses. They're all there in his little book. He was obviously observant, curious, determined, and he gathered plants from some of the most inaccessible places in Orkney, such as the Carfer Flotter, where he found a little plant called wood sorrel in one of its last little strongholds in the whole county. In Hoy he collected ferns and saxifrages which have never been seen before. Not only that, but he drew them, often in fine detail, with the aid of his homemade microscope. Comparing his accounts to the present, we find that some of the plants that he then saw have gone, like the sea pea, which grew all around the coasts of Orkney and has never been seen again, and it's a rare plant in Britain. And there were weeds of cultivation that we don't see anymore, like the wonderfully named shepherd's needle, which was once common but is now gone. This knowledge he distilled into his Flora Orchidensis, which we've heard about, which he completed about 1788. It was the first flora of Orkney written, composed of about 300 entries describing all the species in 2 or 3 sentences, where they grew and a little about the distribution, which is very like a modern flora. In other ways, it is not quite so like a modern flora, in that it's written in Latin almost entirely, and the naming, the taxonomy of the time, Linnaeus had just published his works which revolutionized the system of biological naming, and George partly used that and partly used an older method which was a string of descriptive words and not nearly as clear. Unfortunately for poor George, as we've heard, his flora was not published in his lifetime. Instead, his work was exploited by others, including his supposed benefactor, Thomas Pennant, and then of course George Barry. George's flora was then lost completely and not seen again until a manuscript was found in 1991 in the papers of Malcolm Stewart of Hoy. This is now in the Orkney archive and was finally published in 2003, thanks to the efforts of the late Olaf Cuthbert, who was a GP in Evie. So George's successors were largely unaware of his botanical studies, and surprisingly the only other flora to have been published is that, flora of Orkney to have been published, is that of Magnus Spence in 1914. Has to be said that George's flora is a fairly dry and condensed little document. The real detail and colour comes from his notebooks and drawings, which are in the University of Edinburgh Library, except those few selected by Olaf Cuthbert for his little and brilliant little book. This one, The Life and Letters of George Lowe. The Life and Letters of an Orkney naturalist, George Lowe. So we need to see more of George Lowe. We need a successor to Olaf Cuthbert to see to that.
Thank you again, John. We've described some of the wide-ranging interests of George Lowe and his contribution to Scottish Enlightenment 250 years on. Now he is to be honoured at his own home in Birsay with a plaque which will be unveiled this afternoon on the front wall of the Old Manse by Harvey, Johnston, the convener of Orkney Islands Council. But before that, we have the opportunity to hear Barbara Crawford from the University of St Andrews, who's going to send us a message. Barbara was the person who first gave Anne and myself the reason for investigating the whole possibility of having George Lowe and a plaque, because it was her appeal for a commemoration somewhere in Orkney to George Lowe's work, which was in the foreword to this very book that John was speaking about.
Hello. Some time ago, I wrote an introduction to Dr. Olaf Cuthbert's Life and Letters of an Orkney Naturalist about the Reverend George Lowe, and I suggested that he should have a place of honour in the list of Orcadian scholars and antiquarians, and that his achievements should be publicly recognised, because no monument or plaque existed to record his contribution to learning or to perpetuate his memory. Well, it is very pleasing that the day has come when such a plaque does exist. And this achievement is all due to the valiant efforts of Robin and Anne Barr, who recognised the value of George Lowe's writings and his recording of the natural history of the islands where he lived, although it was not his place of origin. Hopefully, this plaque, as I'm sure it will inspire more people, local and visitors, to read Lowe's books and be aware of the important place which he has among the historians and naturalists who have studied the history of Birsay and the Orkney Islands, and also Shetland. George Lowe, came to live and work in the Orkney Islands in the late 18th century, and he had the interest and ability to record their culture so that it was preserved for visitors and islanders. This was at a time when that culture was changing, so that his writings include precious relics of the older Norse culture. One of the most important items of that record is the survival of remnants of the Old Norse language, or Norn, as it's called, which Lowe recorded from his visit to Fula, as well as the Hildina ballad, a remarkable relic of medieval Norse culture. That legacy will be better appreciated now there is a monument to memorialise his contribution to the record of the history of these islands. This plaque is initiating the process of keeping the memory of the Reverend George Lowe alive in the islands, in the very place which he called home. Recognition of the contribution of such an intelligent and well-informed writer and observer is a step towards our better understanding of the society in these islands, which we all need to acquire in order to appreciate the quality of life and the quality of the culture here.
Well, that's the message from Barbara Crawford. Do enjoy the rest of the afternoon as we go down to open the plaque.
We stand here at the palace on this fine September day. What better place to be on earth than here by Birsay Bay? In this historic settlement where monks and bishops prayed, where Thorfinn ruled half Britain and young Magnus ran and played. For far more than 1,000 years, great men and deeds it's known. George Lowe was in good company here in his Birsay home. He ministered well to his flock, but spent most waking hours logging scientifically all Orkney's plants and flowers. His fine artwork and records he to banks and pennants set, as Birsay's contribution to the Scots Enlightenment. For the statistical account, Lowe wrote about his patch, described his 2 fine parishes. You'd think they'd been a match. But reading Sinclair's worthy tome, I was appalled to see he'd given Birsay 15 pages and Harry only 3. And what he wrote of Harry men, I am ashamed to tell. They lacked that Birsay enterprise and fought when drinking ale. The soil, he said, was thin and poor, with swamps and bogs forby. But worst of all, that Harry had gay poor and ill-fed kye. No thanks to Anne and Robin Barr, should any tourist chance to visit Birsay's palace and come down here by the manse. With wording on this handsome plaque, the world will better know our man of science and of God and Birsay, that's George Lowe. There, oh ho.